Most people believe empires are built with armies. They imagine marching soldiers, burning cities and borders, expanding through violence. That image is comforting because it feels simple, but it's also wrong. The first empire to truly rule the ancient world did not conquer primarily through force. It conquered through systems, long before Rome, long before Britain, long before modern banking or central governments. The Persian Empire discovered something that history would repeat again and again. You don't need to control land if you control the conditions that land depends on. When Persia began expanding in the 6th century BCE, it inherited a problem no empire before it had solved. Its territories were not empty, primitive, or chaotic. They were ancient, wealthy, and highly organized. Babylon already had written legal codes that governed trade and property. Egypt had a priesthood that controlled grain storage, labor, and religious authority for thousands of years. Lydia had introduced coinage and market exchange before Persia ever arrived. Any empire that tried to rule these regions by brute force would have faced permanent rebellion. Persia understood this immediately. Instead of destroying existing systems, it preserved them. Instead of replacing rulers, it absorbed them. Instead of erasing identities, it standardized incentives. This was not tolerance born of kindness. It was precision born of intelligence. Persia recognized that people don't rebel because they dislike rulers. They rebel when their daily lives stop working. So Persia focused on one objective above all others: stability. Taxes were predictable. Tribute obligations were clearly defined. Local customs, religions, and laws were allowed to continue. But beneath this surface, autonomy was something far more important: a unified economic framework. Persia did not invent money. What it did was far more dangerous. It integrated money into governance. Silver became the backbone of imperial accounting, not just trade. Tribute was measured in standardized units, collected systematically across regions that had never shared an economy before. For the first time in history, distant provinces operated under the same fiscal expectations. A merchant in Anatolia could trade with Babylon. A supplier in Egypt could transact with officials in Mesopotamia. This wasn't cultural unity, it was economic interoperability. And that changed everything. Because once markets connect, resistance fragments. Local economies no longer function in isolation. They depend on the larger system. Persia didn't demand loyalty, it engineered dependency. The empire encouraged trade routes to flourish across its territory, not as a side effect, but as a core strategy. Roads were built not only for armies, but for merchants. Storage facilities were protected, markets were secured. The empire became the guarantee behind everyday life. People didn't wake up thinking about Persian power. They woke up thinking about prices, harvests, and trade, and those worked. That is the most effective form of rule. When people benefit from stability, they defend it themselves. This is why Persia scaled when other empires collapsed. It wasn't larger armies, it was fewer disruptions. Persia understood that power does not come from domination alone. It comes from coordination. And once coordination becomes normal, borders lose their meaning. People no longer experience rule as oppression. They experience it as order. This is where empire stopped looking like conquest and started looking like infrastructure. By the time Persia reached its peak, it governed millions of people across continents without needing constant military enforcement. Rebellion was rare, not because it was impossible, but because it was impractical. To rebel meant losing access to markets, losing access to roads, losing access to predictable taxation. Revolt was no longer a moral decision. It was an economic one. And the system made rebellion expensive. This was the first time in history that money became more powerful than fear, and it would not be the last. Persia had quietly discovered a rule that would govern empires for the next 2,000 years. Power does not need to be visible to be effective. It only needs to be reliable. And once a system reaches that point, it no longer needs borders. It expands through dependence, not force. That was the beginning of empire without borders, and it all started with money. What Persia understood next is what transformed a powerful kingdom into a system that could rule continents. Stability alone is not enough to hold an empire together. Stability must be engineered so that no single person can break it. This is where Persia made its most important move. Instead of concentrating authority, it fractured it on purpose. The empire was divided into administrative regions known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed locally, but no satrap ever held total control. Military command, financial administration, and legal authority were deliberately separated. The satrap collected taxes, but did not command the army. The general commanded soldiers, but did not control the treasury. Judges enforced imperial law, but answered to neither. This was not bureaucracy for efficiency. It was architecture for survival. If one official became corrupt, the damage stopped there. If one region failed, the system absorbed the shock. If one leader turned ambitious, they lacked the tools to seize power. Persia had solved the problem that destroyed most empires before they even realized it existed: single points of failure. But fragmentation alone was not enough. The system needed speed. Information had to move faster than rebellion. So Persia built something no empire had ever attempted at scale: a communications and logistics network that treated information as a strategic asset. The royal road stretched across the empire, connecting Anatolia to Mesopotamia and beyond. Messages could travel in days instead of months. Orders could be enforced before resistance had time to organize. But more importantly, trade could flow predictably. Goods moved faster, prices stabilized, markets synchronized. For the first time, economic life across an empire began to behave as a single organism. This is when money stopped being just a tool of exchange. It became a mechanism of coordination. Taxes collected in one region were redistributed elsewhere. Soldiers were paid not with loot, but with wages. Infrastructure projects were funded continuously, not sporadically. Trade was incentivized, not tolerated. Money didn't pool at the center and disappear. It circulated. No declarations, no constant force. Just a system that quietly made alternatives worse. Rebellion didn't fail because Persia crushed it. It failed because rebellion disrupted trade, halted income, and isolated regions from the economic network they depended on. The system punished resistance automatically. And this is where Persia crossed a line no empire before it had crossed. The empire no longer relied on fear to maintain order. It relied on incentives. This changed the psychology of rule. Subjects were no longer conquered people waiting to revolt. They became participants in a system that benefited them unevenly but consistently. That uneven benefit is critical, because systems don't need to be fair. They only need to be functional enough that people tolerate them. Persia did not promise equality. It promised predictability, and predictability is more powerful than justice. By the time Persia reached its height, its greatest strength was no longer its army. It was dependency. Local elites depended on the empire for legitimacy. Merchants depended on it for trade. Cities depended on it for infrastructure. The empire did not sit on top of society. It ran through it. This is why Persia did not collapse from within. Its failure came from outside, and even then, the system survived. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he faced a choice: destroy the system and rule through chaos, or inherit it. He chose inheritance. The satrapies remained, the tax structures stayed, the roads continued operating. Alexander understood something instinctively. If he dismantled the system, he would lose the empire he had just won. So he kept it. And that decision reveals the final truth about power. Empires fall, systems migrate, and once a system proves it can organize millions of lives quietly, efficiently, and predictably, it becomes too valuable to destroy. That is why Persia's empire ended. But Persia's model never did. When you're ready, say, continue with part 3, and we'll complete the arc. How the system echoed through Rome, modern states, and the world you're living in now. When Persia fell, most people assume its power vanished with it. That assumption is wrong, because what Alexander conquered was territory. What he inherited was something far more durable, a blueprint. The Persians had already solved the hardest problem of governance long before modern economics, before political theory, before nation-states. How do you rule people who do not share your language, religion, or identity without ruling them directly? The answer was never domination, it was mediation. Alexander understood this instinctively. So did Rome. So did every empire that lasted longer than a single lifetime. Rome expanded faster than Persia ever did, but it ruled in a familiar way. Local elites remained in place. Taxes were standardized. Currency unified distant markets. Infrastructure synchronized economic life. Roman power didn't sit in the Senate. It sat in roads, law, and money. Citizenship itself became an economic instrument, not a moral one, a functional one. Rome didn't ask who you were. It asked whether you participated. And if you did, you were protected. If you didn't, you were excluded. That same logic repeats again and again. When medieval kings ruled Europe, their authority was never absolute. They were constantly negotiating with financiers, guilds, merchants, and landholders. Wars weren't won by bravery, they were won by credit. This is why banking families survived dynasties. They weren't attached to thrones, they were attached to systems. When a king fell, the debt remained. When borders shifted, trade routes adapted. The crown was symbolic, the ledger was real. And over time, something subtle happened. Power stopped looking like power. It stopped wearing armor. It stopped sitting on thrones. It moved into contracts, institutions, and incentives. By the modern era, the transformation was complete. Governments no longer ruled directly. They managed. They managed currencies. They managed debt. They managed economic stability. Political leaders became temporary stewards of permanent systems. And the people noticed something strange. Elections changed faces, but not structures. Revolutions replaced leaders, but not incentives. Flags changed, currencies adjusted, but the architecture stayed. This is not a conspiracy, it's continuity. The same logic Persia used to govern an empire now governs nations. Fragment authority, separate control, stabilize currency, circulate incentives, punish resistance indirectly. Modern power doesn't need loyalty, it needs participation. You don't have to believe in the system, you just have to depend on it. That's why real power today feels distant, untouchable, abstract. Because it's no longer held by individuals, it's embedded in mechanisms, markets, institutions, monetary policy, global trade dependencies. These systems don't command you. They shape the environment around you until alternatives disappear. And that is the final inheritance of Persia. They didn't invent empire, they invented systemic rule, a form of power so efficient it outlives empires themselves. So when people ask who really rules the world, the answer isn't a king, it isn't a president, it isn't even a single institution. It's the architecture that organizes incentives, money, and dependency at scale. And once you learn to see it, history stops looking random. If this way of understanding power changed how you see the world even slightly, then you'll want to stay here, because every episode on this channel pulls apart another system hiding in plain sight. Subscribe, not for opinions, but for perspective. Because once you recognize how power actually works, you can't unsee it.